The nature of humankind after engaging with something they enjoy is to desire more of it. A good pizza, a pleasant song, or even the company of another person that they fancy. Of course, this also rings true for media. Plenty of books, movies, and TV shows are released with the intention of only having a single installment, whether that's a standalone film or a single season. But sometimes, usually as a result of a surge of popularity, additional content from the media is created. While the motivator for doing so is almost always profit, the amount of success achieved from these sequels range from a stupendous success to completely destroying the reputation of the media. And of course, video games are no exception to this phenomenon. Though I would suggest that video games are actually the least vulnerable to being ruined by a crappy sequel. Want an example of something coming close? Splitgate took the core elements of Halo and integrated portals in a way that provided an incredibly unique and thrilling experience. However, it was announced that the developers were shifting their attention away from Splitgate 1 to work on a sequel, much to the chagrin of the fanbase. Which, let me just check on how that's going. Ah, right. On the other hand, video games can go the other way and be elevated to heights that could only be dreamt of. Helldivers was a small but beloved game that existed in its own space, whereas its sequel took the world by storm and continues to thrive in ways the developers never expected. So, what exactly determines the success of a sequel to a game? By the end of this video, I hope to have demonstrated what I believe to be the most important factors that make or break a sequel. Those factors being how the sequel is elevated compared to the first, the enhancement of the story, how the soul of the game is maintained, and a few other more niche variables that I'll dive into more later. I'll be bringing in various examples of the best video game sequels and how they got such a title, as well as some of the worst, plus some in between. I'll also be mentioning some unique situations with sequels that don't seem to have happened all too often. So, without any further delay, let's get this shindig underway. Let's begin by briefly outlining what qualifies as a sequel. Normally, saying something is a sequel might imply that it's the second after the original, but I'm going to use it interchangeably to mean any game in a series after the first one. Next, a prequel is identical to a sequel, with the only actual difference being that a prequel is stating out loud that the story contained within will take place before the original. Other than that, it is in every way a sequel with gameplay improvements and the like. Sometimes a sequel is actually a prequel in disguise, usually as a part of a plot twist. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 did that. The game, not the movie. Actually, maybe the movie did. I don't know, I haven't seen it. With the reveal of it being a prequel found through various clues. I've never heard of a game that was advertised as being a prequel, but it was actually a sequel as a plot twist. Someone tell me in the comments if that's ever been a thing. Putting the prequel thing aside, most sequels at the very least share a common name to distinguish the fact that they are part of the same series. Sometimes it's done with an official title followed by an identifier, seen in series like Call of Duty or Super Mario. Usually this is done with games that have a long list of sequels, Final Fantasy being another example. Games with only a few installments generally use the same name with a numbered system, such as The Witcher, which, as a side note, you
You
know
know
what
what
really
really
grinds
grinds
my
my gears?
gears? When these numbers don't just go up sequentially, as the creators pick a number that has implications from the game's story, like how Fallout went from Fallout 4 to Fallout 76, because of the year the game takes place in. I think I would be fine with it if the numbers only ever went up, but with something like Battlefield naming their 2016 release Battlefield 1 because it takes place during World War 1, followed by Battlefield 2042 because again, the year the game takes place in, to finally going back to Battlefield 6 because now the year isn't relevant enough and they want to pick up back the sequence from Battlefield 5. Could you imagine if Black Ops 2 was named Black Ops 2025, only for the next game to be Black Ops 3, even though it takes place further into the future? The names would sound so clunky compared to the ease of understanding that comes with just saying Black Ops 2. And while you might think I'd be annoyed at Black Ops Cold War not having the number 5 in its title, I'm actually okay with it. Both because it doesn't use another number, and the following game was designated as Black Ops 6, not 5, which reduces the confusion massively. Alright, this tangent about naming sequels has gone on long enough. And honestly, I don't know how much more there is to say about what a sequel actually is. It's pretty simple if you're familiar with games. I'll mention that there's a difference between a sequel and DLC, as one is a separate product, and generally is a complete package, whereas DLC is an expansion of an existing game. While that may seem obvious, some sequels start out as planned DLC. Silksong is a prime example of that. And of course, DLC is able to have the benefit of the base game in order to be considered good, something sequels don't have outside of Reputation. Which is why they shouldn't be eligible for Game of the Year. Furthermore, remakes or remasters do not qualify as sequels, even if there are gameplay adjustments or quality of life improvements. Take the recent Oblivion re release as an example. It still is the same game as before, and not meant to be a continuation in the series. And finally, it is good to understand that a game like Skyrim is a sequel to Oblivion because they both belong to the Elder Scrolls franchise. But Starfield is not a sequel to either of these, despite being made by the same company and essentially being Skyrim in space. Simply being similar games by the same developers does not implicitly equal a sequel. You wouldn't claim that Baldur's Gate and the Divinity games are aligned as a series either, nor Elden Ring with Dark Souls 1 through 3. Now then, let's turn our attention to dissecting each of my main points for what decides whether a sequel is set up for success or not, starting with the elevation of gameplay. What I mean when I say elevated is a combination of adjustments to the original formula combined with an expansion of the existing mechanics with a touch of quality of life updates. This is unquestionably the most crucial component of a successful sequel, as releasing a game in a series that doesn't grow in any meaningful way can be quite a disappointment. Anyone ever play Skylanders? The first game was so successful, despite how bare bones it was in hindsight, because the novelty of bringing your action figures to life using the portal carried the lack of standout gameplay. This was most felt with the second game, Giants, as the various gameplay designs weren't significantly better, and the only new novelty was Skylanders, but now they're slightly bigger. Still a good game, but it felt far too similar to the first game, which was already pretty simplistic. However, the third game, Swap Force, finally felt like a worthy sequel, between massively improved elements like the levels, enemies, and challenges, to the actually interesting addition of Skylanders that can be mixed and matched to fit your preferences. And you can jump! Quick, someone make up a list of game series where the ability to jump is absent at the beginning, but eventually gets added and feels like it always belonged. Another good example of this elevation in gameplay is the Borderlands series. I mentioned in a previous video how Borderlands 3 is by far the best in the series if you exclude the story components, which admittedly is hard to do because the story is many people's favorite parts. Handsome Jack in the second game is one of the best villains of all time, and that's just a fact. But if we were to exclude the story for the sake of argument and just compare the gameplay of Borderlands 2 and 3, it would quickly become clear how much more fluid and crisp the third game really is. From the movement system, including things like mantling, to the gunplay being fast paced and chock full of unique and interesting weapons that perfectly pairs with the loot system that finally doesn't feel like you have to rely on the dumb golden key system outside the game to farm for legendary weapons. Borderlands 3, outside of the story, which, again, valid complaints, is a prime example of how to continuously evolve a game several sequels in. Elevation of gameplay is separate to my next point, which is still very critical to making a sequel stand out, and that's how the formula of the original game is changed. Notice how I didn't say improved, because unlike certain gameplay elements that can pretty easily be argued as better or worse, a game's formula is much more subjective. Let's take the Five Nights at Freddy's example again. The formula for the first 6 games was constantly molded, but always remained true to the original. You play a person who is under attack and must fend off the threat through the decided mechanics of the game, usually a combination of cameras, doors, flashlights, and/or power management. Yet, despite the repetition of these features, there are few complaints about it, and in fact, I would wager there were far more concerns raised for the one game of the 6 that broke away from the formula people were used to: Sister Location. People ached and moaned about Cawthorn's design to mix things up by creating a more on-the-rails game that wasn't focused on the same night getting progressively more difficult as the week goes on, but rather a set of puzzles that loosely utilized the 5 nights as a measure of progression. Which, interestingly enough, was also done by perhaps the most controversial FNAF game, Security Breach.
Please, get me in! Friday! Friday, you bitch! Friday!
But besides that, people roiled over how this wasn't a true FNAF game. And yes, I know there's a whole custom night that returns the game to what people expected, as well as the secret ending. But just in regards to the main game in the 5 nights, it was the first large deviation from the formula. The uproar is somewhat understandable, as rather than figuring out a strategy to endure the increasing difficulty of going through nights 1 through 5, having to rely on the somewhat unreliable narrator of the phone guy, you're instead presented with a series of puzzles that are laid out explicitly. Even though the soul of the game is preserved within the classic FNAF horror elements, something I'll touch on more later, the formula being altered in this manner rubbed certain fans the wrong way. On the other hand, I see lots of praise for Sister Location trying something new, and doing something that allows for people's favorite parts of the series to take a front seat, that being the story. There were several breathtaking moments that could never happen in the classic FNAF formula.
Yeah, okay, how about that? Oh.
Great.
My overall point here is that the formula for Sister Location was changed in a way that was pretty divisive, but by no means egregious enough to torpedo the success of the franchise. I would argue that it was less about the formula being altered that caused disdain, and more about how this new system wasn't done properly. Despite that, it seems like the combination of time and the failure of Security Breach warmed a lot of people to Sister Location well after the initial hate wore off. Some even claiming it's their favorite FNAF game, which, more power to them. Let's switch focus to another sequel that didn't just mix up their formula, but instead did a complete genre change, that being the Darkest Dungeon games. Both can technically be classified as roguelike dungeon crawlers, but each game places a high emphasis on only one of these descriptors. The first game was all about the dungeon crawling, whereas the second placed a much higher emphasis on the roguelike features. Honestly, the existence of the second game makes the first feel nothing like a roguelike. So, how successful was Darkest Dungeon 2? Very, to be succinct. The game's launch was a little dicey, mostly because there were a lot of people who were very displeased with the roguelike elements being pushed to the front with the sequel. But for anyone who is willing to give the game a fair shot, the new installment proved to be not just a worthy sequel, but a better one in my opinion. The roguelike formula allows for some of the best parts of the first game, that being the steady increase of power, tense combats against a wide variety of foes, and careful strategy to be more upfront, without having to worry about managing all the elements you do in the first game, which of course some people do enjoy a great deal, but the roguelike formula also allows for some of the most frustrating elements of the first game to be less severe. Losing an entire campaign with dozens of hours, or even just a team wipe of max level heroes, feels miles worse than losing a run in Darkest Dungeon 2, or losing heroes who have a few memories equipped. Again, the stakes being lower is certainly a downside for some, and naturally the Darkest Dungeons are meant to be unforgiving games. But anyone who has played the games can tell you, when the game decides to delete your healer without you being able to do anything about it, it feels a lot better to only lose a couple of hours of a DD2 run than the dozens put into a DD1 campaign.
And he's not even gonna bleed out from that. Holy God!
Palpable fear.
This is the first fight! What the hell?
Their formation is broken. Maintain the offensive.
What is going on? This is so bad.
Surges as the enemy crumbles.
Okay, please don't kill her! Oh my God!
All of that being said, I don't think you can actually claim one game is straight up better than the other, mainly because of this formula change. Obviously, you can have your preferences and have more fun with one above the other, but due to the way the gameplay foundations are completely separate, it's like apples and oranges. You wouldn't start comparing Fortnite to Dark Souls, the games are in completely different spaces. I already said I enjoy the sequel more than the first, and not just because of this formula change, but more so of the final important elevation addition to any good sequel: quality of life improvements. Quality of life can mean a few different things, depending on the game. Generally, it involves tweaks or fixes that wouldn't necessarily save the game from failure, but rather sand over some rough edges, as well as providing more ease of access. For example, Concord wouldn't have avoided complete disaster if it had more quality of life. And though many games in the modern era tend to come with plenty of nice mechanics that we may take for granted, it only takes replaying older games in a franchise to realize that things like quick saving, fast travel, dungeon design looping the end back to the start, bestiaries, changing keybinds, and so much more made gaming all the more pleasant. These days, having all of the quality of life bits doesn't necessarily make a game better, as most gamers expect these things to be included. What instead happens is a game will get released missing some of these features, such as Fallout 76 missing things like an FOV slider, and the game will suffer as a result. Therefore, a sequel cannot hope to gain more favor by implementing common quality of life mechanics, only avoiding negative feedback and bad reviews that all ask for what is missing, unless the obvious outlier being that a previous game in the series was lacking such features. Switching gears, a big make or break element of a sequel is how it handles the continuation of the story being told. Naturally, this varies depending on the game and what sort of story it's trying to tell. I already mentioned the Borderlands 3 example, where the gameplay was the best of the series when it released, yet the story was by far the worst. It put the game in a weird position where people who didn't pay much attention to the story thought the game was immaculate, while those who worship Handsome Jack as God's gift to antagonists hated Borderlands 3 with all of their might. Yet, because the gameplay was so good, the game was still seen as a success, just not the standout best in the series. A different series that has several examples of an installment all but torpedoing their storyline is Call of Duty. Anyone old enough to be needing to schedule a colonoscopy will probably claim that their favorite COD is Black Ops 2, partly because of the campaign with branching choices and multiple endings. They will also probably claim that Black Ops 3 is the worst story ever and isn't even connected to the previous game outside of a throwaway line that means nothing. Which, to be clear, is absolutely correct. Black Ops 3 was still successful, mostly thanks to the zombies mode and only multiplayer that made the advanced movement feel right, but the story in the campaign was abysmal. This was repeated again in the Modern Warfare series, with the first one being a wildly strong start, the second being an alright addition, but the third one being an absolute nightmare that genuinely gives off vibes that was written by AI. Naturally, the series continues to survive because, like the banks, COD is too big to fail. But in terms of people's rankings of the games, they hold the lackluster story against it. Inversely, there are plenty of game sequels that have a stronger story than the first. Borderlands 2 already being mentioned, with Titanfall 2 and pretty much all of the God of War games after the first being good examples. Important to note that many games either don't have a story to worry about maintaining, like the Pokemon games, which are individual tales, or games with no story at all, like tycoon builders such as The Sims. There's a lot more that could be said about what these sort of games can get away with, as well as games where the story isn't very relevant to the overall quality of the game. So if you want to hear me dissect that, go watch this video on the channel. Overall, the key takeaway is that for games that have interesting stories, their sequels need to continue to toe the line, or see their ratings suffer as a result. The final few variables are much more minor, so I'll go through them quickly so we can get into analyzing some very interesting sequel situations. The next factor for a sequel's success is something I already brought up with the FNAF games, that being the soul or identity of a game to be maintained. Not to spend the whole video plugging my other content, but the identity of a game is something I've already gone into depth about when I discussed Call of Duty's progression as a series, where I questioned that identity in modern releases, where the vibes of self-sacrifice and doing one's part for their country hasn't really been a focus since World War II. I want to really focus on the soul side of things, which really comes down to the purpose of the sequel being created. Of course, at the end of the day, it's about money. Welcome to the state of the world. But what can be quantified to hamper a sequel's success is how insidious the creation is. I brought Splitgate up in the beginning of the video, because even though there's no way to prove the sequel was born of greed, it's really hard to figure out what the alternative would be. Splitgate 1 was beloved by its relatively small community, and there was intrigue when the sequel was announced at the Summer Games Fest. Right until it was announced the game would now have character classes that turned out just to be another way to add microtransactions. Or macrotransactions, considering how much the cosmetics would eventually cost. So, all the sequel did was fracture the dedicated player base and show the rest of the gaming world that the developers aren't to be trusted. I don't want to endlessly thrash Splitgate 2 because it's impossible to prove what the developers' intentions were, unlike games like Battlefield 2042, which introduced operators in spite of the classic Battlefield class system, just so they can sell skins. Or, of course, the infamous Star Wars Battlefront 2 launch state. Most games are able to stick to their essence and make the correct choices in a sequel to avoid the allegations of greed. However, the soul of a game can still be lost if the sequel deviates too far from what drew people to the game in the first place. No matter how much the FNAF series changes in its gameplay, the soul of the original game is as undying as William Afton. Even with the shift in genres, Darkest Dungeon 2 remained full of eldritch monstrosities with a gothic atmosphere. Call of Duty lets you shoot people who will call you slurs in return, no other notes. A game like Dragon Age Veilguard is the prime example of a game that lost its essence. And because I'm eager to start talking about specific sequels, I'm just going to plug another video I found that I think does a fantastic job properly ripping this game apart. But before we move on, I want to quickly mention that a sequel does not need to improve upon the previous game's graphics. Obviously, if there's room for that, all the better, such as how Darkest Dungeon 2 switches to 3D models, which look fantastic. But I always believe that graphics are a secondary feature to add flavor to something that's already good. And a straight improvement isn't always a positive, especially in game sequels that turn out to be difficult to run on weaker computers. Just ask the City Skylines community how they feel about that. I tried to be balanced in my examples of good and bad sequels, but I have to admit that it was a lot easier to find positive examples of sequels rather than abhorrent ones. And that's really because even though there are certainly sequels that aren't as good as the first or previous game in a series, there are relatively few that are so atrocious it tanks the entire franchise. Not a lot of ETs to cause a video game crash. And further than that, it seems on average, sequels tend to be better than their predecessors if you don't include the super long running series. This is something I wasn't expecting to say after I began writing this script, mainly because it seems like other forms of media, with movies and television, have the opposite effect. Anyone else wish shows like Stranger Things or Squid Game had stayed true to their creators' original intent of being a single season? Otherworldly and thought provoking tales that told stories that were perfect the way they were, only to have the greed of Netflix swoop in and demand more. But this is about video games, so let's switch gears and take a look at a few interesting cases for sequels going right, going left, and going wrong. First, let's aim our analysis on the many long running game series that continue to release new games to this day. I listed some examples earlier, such as COD, or sports games like FIFA or 2K. Lots to choose from. The most obvious question regarding these ongoing releases is how do the creators continuously find new ways to enhance, excite, and expand the latest installment to maintain the interest of the players? One method is actually to do none of that and instead focus on utilizing a live service model for the newest game to include limited time events with content that either incites FOMO or otherwise makes acquiring what's at stake much more difficult if you miss out. In this way, players are incentivized to always buy the latest edition and abandon any of the previous the moment it comes. A pretty scummy method if you ask me, but unfortunately not an uncommon one, especially with games that get released on a yearly cycle. Hell, even Pokemon has done it in games, which made obtaining special Pokemon impossible now. Of course, this does extend to battle passes, which plagues many of the games I have gone over. But returning to what makes sequels actually better, let's take a look at what the majority of players agreed as the best in a few different series and see what stands out. For COD, as said previously, Black Ops 2 is a well agreed number one, or at least in the top 3 for most people. And if you analyze what stood out most, it was the several major innovations in every mode. The campaign had branching paths made by your decisions, multiplayer had the first pick 10 system, and zombies started to have more emphasis on the main Easter egg instead of just being a horde mode. Out of all these things, the only prevalent one is the zombies being more complex. Which is then no surprise that of all the latest CODs, the best mode has consistently been the zombies. Out of all the Fallouts, New Vegas tends to be agreed as the best. And if you set aside the fact that the game is held together by duct tape, people point towards the story and its many branching paths as one of the main reasons it's the best in the series. This heightened sense of roleplay in a world that is molded by your choices you make, with in depth skill checks that are unique to the build you are going for, all in a world full of fascinating characters and places. Seen in other Fallouts, of course, but New Vegas just did it better. Out of all the Mortal Kombats, MK9 is considered the best, yet again due to the story, alongside what many people believe is the best character designs that stand out all these years later. And above all else, a return to the Mortal Kombat essence that had been missing from the previous installments. What's the through line between all of these? Well, Maybe it's less about what the best games did and more about what the worst games didn't do. COD has not done another meaningful campaign with branching paths outside of Cold War, and it isn't a coincidence that it's another one of the highest rated campaigns in the series. The Pick 10 system hasn't been seen in 8 years, having been replaced by the balancing nightmare of just putting a bajillion attachments on your gun. Fallout 4 had your character actually speak, using an awful 4 option only speech system that takes all of the wind out of the sails for roleplay. The main essence of being able to roleplay a survivor in nuclear winter was completely neutered, seen also by the very few consequences important quests leave on the world. It's no wonder one of the most popular mods for the game turns dialogue into the New Vegas version. And Mortal Kombat? Well, I have to admit I'm not very up to date with how the latest games have been received outside of the research I've done, but just like with Fallout, people have a perceived idea of what they want a game in the series to look like, and MK9 captured that essence the best. Of course, at the end of the day, people still hold these games close to their heart and are perfectly happy to play the same relatively few games in the rotation by just buying the latest release year in and year out. Frankly, I envy that. To just be able to enjoy their hobby without feeling the pressure to play games that are highly rated must be a nice outlook to have. Let's move on to some more specific examples. Anyone who has heard of Overwatch has most likely some semblance of the Overwatch 2 debacle. In short, the number one hero shooter for many years announced they were going to launch a sequel with one of the most requested additions since the game's launch, an expanded player versus environment game mode that takes the existing PvE content and amplifies it to push the Overwatch story forward. Lore was already a big part of Overwatch, but it was all existing tales explaining how the characters got to where they are today. Now, people want to see what comes next, especially with the announcement trailer being essentially a sequel to the intro for Overwatch 1.
Do do we have enough people for this mission?
As long as we stick together, we'll be fine.
And the reveals for skill trees for each hero increasing the hype for PvE even more. One catch though. Support for Overwatch 1 would be paused, so Blizzard could dedicate their full team to take on the monumental promise. And so, for 3 years, Overwatch had very little content added, only for the launch of the sequel to have PvE content delayed, and, spoiler alert, eventually announced to be dead. The task was too great, and there had already been plenty of layoffs that ultimately forced the difficult decision to be made. And though people raged and complained at the news, the developers did make good on their promise to take what they did create and turn it into something new, which eventually would be the Stadium game mode, which, I have to admit, is a lot of fun. Still very disappointing that the PvE and lore content was sent to the grave, but they are now currently making strides to include more of that sweet, sweet lore going forward. That all being said, there were a few things that did change in Overwatch 2 that I think people take for granted as being monumental alterations. To get the negative out of the way, the loot box system was removed, and a shop with overpriced skins plus a battle pass system was put in instead. And though loot boxes have their own infamy, Overwatches were actually pretty good in how many coins you could acquire through all the ones you got for free, in order to pick out exactly what you want. Kinda like Apex Legends in a way. Of course, they would end up bringing loot boxes back, but the shop and battle pass remain. There are other negatives for the sequel, albeit very minor, like the hero cards at the end of the game being removed, as well as your player level, but nothing that impacts the actual gameplay. What was changed, and what makes Overwatch 2 not a completely pointless sequel, is those tweaks to the gameplay. People who don't consistently play Overwatch will struggle to understand how these seemingly minor changes actually set up the game to be on the right track and to grow in the right direction. But experienced players should at the very least acknowledge that what I'm about to go through were all positive additions. First was the transition to 5v5 instead of 6v6, with the removal of a tank in the role queue modes, which, for those who don't know, is the default for most modes. This allowed for all of the tanks to get buffed and or changed to fit their new solo tank position. I know some people think this was a very poor choice, usually citing the interesting team comps and tank pairings that people like to play. I can acknowledge that this is a fair complaint, but with how fractional the tank mains are already, for the sake of queue times alone, I think the trade-off is more than worth it. And yeah, you could argue the devs could do a better job balancing or designing tanks to be enjoyable, but I think there's only so much you can do to make people want to play that role. Overwatch has some of the most diverse tank heroes, yet no matter what the devs do, the role will still come down to a punching bag that is meant to take space, reliant on their team to take advantage of what they're doing. It's a stressful role, especially compared to the ease of playing support or being able to do your own thing on DPS. The other big transition seen in Overwatch 2 was the removal of several stuns and crowd control abilities, and giving more of that identity to tanks. Insert the XQC clip here. Now, Cassidy's flashbang doesn't stun, Mei can't freeze, Doomfist was made into a tank, and Bridget's stun was removed. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but all of these characters were notorious in one aspect or another, and the game as a whole feels a lot better when accessing an anti-fun mechanic like a stun is much harder to come by. So why do I credit the sequel with this being done, instead of pointing out that these changes could have been implemented without needing a whole sequel? Because the Overwatch fanbase is, for lack of a better term, f***ing crazy. You've got a subreddit for every hero in the game who all believe they are victims of game balance, people who don't even play the game but like to start fights in forums, and everyone in between who is ready to go online and vent about the exact reason why they lost their last competitive game. There's people who take streamers' opinions as gospel, those who think picking a niche character is throwing their game when they're ranked platinum. I could go on and on. Point is, while it is by no means the most toxic fanbase, the community is a rabid dog who snarls at any sign of change they may not like. So, when the devs began working on a sequel release, it allowed them to implement some more of these bold decisions and use the transition as a cushion against the naysayers. Before I move on, I will throw in that Overwatch 2 also made the game free to play, partially justifying the more egregious store prices and Battle Pass introduction. While I believe every game should be consumer friendly no matter how much it costs, I do concede that free to play games can get away with more than paid games. Overwatch was a unique circumstance for a sequel release, and it honestly was more of a Siege X or Rocket League becoming free to play transition rather than a straight up sequel. Now, I want to take a good look at the undisputed king of sequels, and the developer that everyone should look to for understanding how to make a proper game. Without further ado, Steam's creator and gigachads of the gaming world, Valve. Valve's formula was simple. Create a game with an interesting concept and an inviting but ultimately brief story that captures the wonder of all those who try the game. Then, once the game has been a success, add and refine the game's mechanics and story to capitalize on what people liked most, while quietly tempering the parts that they didn't. Portal 1 was a bite-sized puzzle game that included GLaDOS, who was an intriguing but somewhat one-note villain who liked conducting tests in a comedic but very sadistic manner. Instead of the sequel just adding more puzzles with the same character mocking you once again, well, I guess they did do that, but there were also new characters that quickly became beloved, with some of the greatest and frankly hilarious world building in any game.
I want your damn lemons! What am I supposed to do with these?
And the pivotal essence of the character you play, Shell, doesn't suddenly start quipping back to GLaDOS in the sequel. She's the same mute lunatic throughout the entire game. Separately, Team Fortress got the same treatment, although the glow-up was a lot more noticeable regarding the style of the game. That being said, TF Classic was born out of a mod for Half-Life, and while I doubt that many people who play TF2 have actually gone back to play the classic version, it still stands as another example of Valve perfecting a game via a sequel. In fact, TF2 might be one of Valve's greatest glow-ups from the original game, from how the game plays, ease of accessibility, visuals, and several very welcome changes to make classes like the Spy feel way less clunky. Alas, this isn't the first sequel that Valve has released that was born from a mod. Dota 2 and Counter-Strike 2 both have their roots in mods from Warcraft 3 and Half-Life respectively. And, considering that both of these games are still putting up illustrious numbers to this day, it's hard to say these sequels are anything but brilliant. You may be wondering why there aren't more games in these series. Valve's trademark and most influential game, Half-Life, which as I just mentioned spawned several mods for future games, has more than just 2 games released under its moniker. Yet, just like all of Valve's other titles, there is yet to be a Half-Life 3, of course creating the seemingly everlasting joke that Gabe Newell can't count to 3. But I think there is something else going on. I started this video mentioning that nearly all sequels in games, movies, TV shows, books, etc. are created with profit as the first and foremost motivator. Perfectly natural. Yet I'm sure many sequels had only the passion of the project behind them, with money simply being a means to an end. Valve is a company meant to make money, but they are also smart, shown by their ability to keep a monopoly on game distribution through the genius strategy of not shooting yourself in the foot. All jokes aside, this clever tactic of doing the smart thing above the most profitable thing extends to why they elect to keep these masterpieces left alone. There simply is nothing else to do with the gameplay or story of these beloved games. Whether that's because they don't want to pull a splitgate with their live service games that already garner thousands of daily players, or because adding anything else to a story like Portal makes no sense with its perfect ending. Not that I think people would be upset if Portal 3 were announced, but just like with any sequel announcement, people would immediately worry about the legacy of the series. Expectations are killer, after all. I think that's everything I wanted to say. Like I said, video game sequels tend to be the most consistent in their success, unlike most other forms of media, which may be part of the reason why AAA studios elect to play it safe by continuously churning out games in the same series that they already know has popularity. It may also be scary for them to see original titles become massive flops, though I would suggest these disasters are more due to game studios trying to make every release the next fortnight rather than a more reasonable goal. Those expectations, man, they'll always get you. In short, a strong video game sequel doesn't just rehash what made the first game great, but rather finds room for growth in both the gameplay as well as foundation for ease of access. It can be a fundamental transition that preserves key elements but turns the rest on its head, or it can just be the exact same game but better. More interesting, more engaging, could be more detailed, but no matter what changes, the core essence of what made people fall in love with the original must be preserved. And though the game is made with a massive sales as the end goal, that must never get in the way of what people actually want. Not an excuse to sell people the same game again, not to refill a store with overpriced skins or a battle pass, and not a cobbled together mess that betrays what the original or previous games in the series stood for. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, I think YouTube has removed the feature to show it, and if you want to agree with my takes or fight me, I think the comment section is still around as well. Until the next one, see ya!